Thank you for that introduction. I really enjoyed the video. Naveen, thank you for that. That was the first time I had seen it, so I had a rough cut, but beautifully done. Thank you. And our first speaker, wow, that was really great. Thank you. So here's the problem with Lauren's presentation as I was listening to it. I'm telling the same story. So we're talking about wildscaping at the 200 square feet level, maybe, and now we're talking about wildscaping at the 2,000 acre level. So what, of course, we hope is that, you know, as you're listening to the programs as we go along, you're going to find messages that are appropriate for you to take home and you to use. And so that's what we're doing next, is talking about a bigger picture approach to wildscaping. And one of the things you're going to notice as we go along here, we put people up on this stage and we all kind of, I guess, pretend to be experts. And one of the things about experts is if you put enough of them at that table, you're going to find there's a lot of different opinions about how to do things. And that's one of the beauties of having the kind of discussion, is that, you know, we all form our own beliefs as we go about what we want to do with our own wildscaping in our own backyard. So we're going to discuss some of that, and you're going to see maybe some differences and some different things for us to discuss and ask questions about as we go along here. I hope you've been to the Nature Center. If you've not, if you haven't been there, here we are. We manage about 4 square miles of urban wilderness habitat. And those are two words that you don't often hear in the same sentence, urban and wilderness. So Lauren was talking about urban wilderness right in your own backyard, and so am I. It's just that ours is just a little broader scope and scale than what you guys might be able to do in your own backyard. We're adjacent to Galveston Bay, just off the western shore. We're a tributary of Clear Lake, which means that the waters of Armand Bayou are actually tidally influenced, making it an estuary. So we'll talk a little bit more about all those things as we go along here. But the big picture is that this is one of the best preserved, largest pieces of wild land left in Harris County. And our mission is to do just that, to preserve it, to conduct restoration ecology, to promote wildscaping, which is what we're doing in the larger, bigger picture of things. But we also provide a lot of environmental education about those systems, those ecosystems that are right in our own backyard. So we do a pretty good job educationally, teaching about global systems, teaching about coral reefs and tropical rainforests. But what we're trying to do is what the Native Plant Society and Wildscaping is also trying to do, which is promote a better understanding of the ecology that's right here, literally right in our own backyard. So that's why we're here today. And it's hard to believe that in the blink of an eye, Harris County has changed so dramatically. Here's a picture of Armand Bayou. A picture of Armand Bayou roughly about the year I was born. So a couple of things should be dramatic for you when you look at this picture. And the first dramatic element of it is what? What stands out when you look at Armand Bayou here? Yeah, the first thing is, wow, there's nothing there. And that's not really true, you know, for those of us that are ecologists, we know there's really something there. But as far as any type of human structure, as far as any type of habitation, you have to look close to find it. And if you do look close, you can see a few roads. You can see NASA Road 1. You can see the beginnings of the turnings of dirt for the Johnson Space Center. That's why this picture was taken. But this is Armand Bayou, this little waterway that flows up, going into Pasadena, headed towards what's now the Houston Ship Channel. But for us as ecologists, when we look at this, what we really see is the representation of the 3 major ecosystems that once occurred here. And as wildscapers, that's important to us because these are the assembly of plants, the plant communities that are spread around us in the back of the room now that we may want to take pieces from to use in our own backyards. They're actually historic models that ecologists look back at to give us some guidance as to what our restoration goals are. So that's an important thing also, not just how much that we've changed and what we looked like not so long ago, but we originally were made up of grasslands, of these riparian forests that line the edges of the waterways, and of these tidal streams, these estuaries that are right here in Harris County. But things have changed, and they've changed quite dramatically. Here's Armand Bayou again. Let's blink our eyes. That's the way it seems to me when I think about where I've gone in this amount of time. It's been like a blink of an eye. And today, Harris County is the most populated county in Texas, and it is the third most populated county in the United States. And I just heard on a documentary radio last week that 25% of the population of Texas lives in the Houston metropolitan area. So there's a lot of us all jammed in right here, living close together, and it has radically transformed the landscape into a human-built environment. And oftentimes not so much for the better ecologically, and that's where the real value is. You heard Lauren talking about why Wildscape. Well, here's the graphic image. Why Wildscape is that the wild is really not here anymore. And as she mentioned the importance, it's important to preserve big pieces of land and those little pieces of land right in your own backyard. So significant amount of change in a really short period of time. And as the video pointed out, what we really once had here was mostly coastal tallgrass prairie. This is our ecological heritage. This is if we could have traveled back in time and flown over the Houston metropolitan area, this would have really been what was here, these grasslands. And these are not the grasses that you start with in your backyard wildscape. They're very different than those St. Augustine lawns. These are truly tall grasses, as tall as you and me. So prairies are a plant community that are dominated by grasses. It's an important element. It's one of the things that I don't see a lot of back here. One of the things that increasingly we're trying to grow more of are more of these native grass species. So even though they're a plant community dominated by grasses, it turns out that they're actually much more than just grasslands. They are one of the most species-rich plant communities in North America. And some of our best remnant representations of prairies left today have about 300-400 species left in one of these remnant tallgrass prairies. Most of you folks have heard of the Deer Park Prairie. That's probably one of our best local postage stamp prairies that really has this long assembly of plants. Over 300 species in the Deer Park Prairie. It's only about 50 acres in size. So it's not very big, but it's very species rich, and in fact some of these most valuable remnant prairies are home to some of the rarest of the rare of prairie orchids and other species that are still surviving today. But going back in time, we look back, we see Houston was these types of plant communities, and we can see really that all up and down the Texas coast, this is what we once looked like. Running roughly from Corpus Christi to Lafayette, Louisiana, running inland about 50 miles from the Gulf of Mexico, these coastal prairies are what dominated the Houston area landscape. Today, however, tremendously reduced. Why Wildscape? Only about 1% of the coastal prairie still survives. It's a critically imperiled habitat. 99% reduced. So when we're wildscaping on the small scale, one of the things to remember is that these are the habitats that were once here, and creating those pocket prairies in your backyard, using those prairie plant species in your backyard, gives that small refugia to those different forms of wildlife that hopefully might be making their way back to Armand Bayou Nature Center also. These types of habitats evolved in close association with two key ecological influences, historic influences, one of which were huge sweeping wildfires. And there are many numerous accounts of these types of fires moving across the landscape. and burning until they encountered a natural fire break. Oftentimes those would have been the Gulf of Mexico, lakes. We used to think big river systems stopped these fires, but Lauren was talking about that big drought in 2011, that Bastrop fire. We just passed the anniversary of the Bastrop fire. You might have seen it on the news. It jumped across the Colorado River. So under certain conditions, those fires were capable, maybe until a big weather event, a big rain event would have put those fires out. They also evolved with influences of grazing animals, and these big sweeping herds of the American bison did come all the way down to the Houston area. Maybe you've heard of Buffalo Bayou. These guys were many, many hundreds of thousands in their head, and as they would graze the landscape, they had a number of important ecological influences. But that key influence that they had was suppressing woody plant encroachment into those grasslands. Today, as we've looked in that big picture of how Armand Bayou has changed, we drive and look out our car window. That's a picture out of my car window. It seems like there's a for sale sign everywhere. And oftentimes it's in some of the best of what remains. I know there are some of you in this room that have worked very tirelessly to try to salvage some of these remnant small prairie habitats, digging those rare plants up, bringing them back to use them elsewhere, trying to preserve those unusual species. But habitat loss is one of the real reasons that we wildscape. And it's not just in Harris County. Worldwide, habitat loss is considered one of the biggest ecological threats that we face. I had a big news release this week of just how much wilderness across the world has been destroyed in the last century and how much remains. So habitat loss, this direct conversion, you see the for sale sign, you see bare dirt behind it, that's continuing, and it's one of the biggest risks that we face worldwide. Sometimes, however, habitat is not lost, it's just degraded. Look at this prairie. It doesn't really quite look like prairie, but if you squint real close, you can see some little blue stem, some bushy blue stem. You can see a remnant prairie plant community there, just as we were describing earlier. But what you also see is the abundance of those woody plants, trees and shrubs encroaching. And this is a prairie that has not been exposed to those historic influences. No fire, no grazing, no management by the stewardship coordinator. So what happens over time here, as you see, is some of these species you might recognize, even though it's leafless right now, is a Chinese tallow tree. We know from its name, Chinese tallow tree, that's not a native plant society plant. We're not selling those, are we? No, good. So some of them are easily recognizable as being problematic for this historic grassland community. Some of them, it might confuse even a native plant society person because this is a yaupon and this is a red oak. So it turns out that in the absence of those historic influences of fire and of grazing animals, sometimes even native plant communities compete. And once those historic influences disappeared, over a period of time, as these plants are competing, you know, that's sometimes another thought we don't have very often. Plant competition. It ain't like the NBA Finals. It's not exciting to watch. It takes a long time to reach the end point of what happens over a 20-year period is habitat conversion. So we had one of the most species-rich plant assemblies in North America shown to you moments ago. Coastal tallgrass prairie, 300 and 400 species of plants. This is a monoculture. Now we're down to one. This is a single species of invasive Chinese tallow tree that now has reached this closed canopy conversion to where all of the sunlight is being harvested in the canopy of this Chinese tallow forest. The entire biodiversity that was once rich with those plants, the insects, all of the other species that were part of that living community now have disappeared. So the question becomes, what is an invasive species? And usually it's really easy for us, it's easy to process the fact that's a Chinese tallow tree. That means we brought that plant from across the globe to here. And oftentimes it's easy for us to process. We bring that with us. It comes to a new home range. That new home range lacks the natural set of checks and balances. In its home range, it had evolved over a long period of time in association with a living community to help keep its population balanced. We bring it here to a new home range. A lot of times it doesn't have that natural set of balances in the ecosystem to keep it in place. It's a little more challenging when we look at yaupons and red oaks. It's equally challenging for the Native Plant Society of Texas to look at a Texas native, and this is a native tree to Texas. This is Palo Verde, a Jerusalem thorn, Parkinsonia. It's a plant that's native to South Texas. And if you look closely at this image, you can see some traffic signals and you can see some lights and power lines underneath it. Clear Lake City was built. They built roads down through the thoroughfares, and they planted these trees along Bay Area Boulevard, right over the top of the drainage ways, right over the tops of the gutters that run down and ultimately feed and flow through the watershed into Armand Bayou. And these plants have big, robust seeds about the size of a pinto bean, and boy, they float and travel well. And so, can a Texas plant be invasive? And the answer is yes, but again, ask the experts, and you're probably going to get a little bit of determination. When does a plant travel far enough to become invasive? For me, as the person making the decision at Armand Bayou Nature Center, I would tell you this plant is not native to the Clear Lake watershed, and it was brought here by humans, and it was planted on Bay Area Boulevard, and slowly over time we've begun to see them and begun to treat them as an invasive species. So it's complicated. The answers sometimes are complicated as we look more closely at the questions. And we redistribute those plants from all over the place, sometimes because they're beautiful, like the Parkinsonia, sometimes because they're good forage for our cattle, such as vasi grass, sometimes, as with the tallow in the 1950s, as Houston was going through an explosive growth boom in human population, tallows were used as nursery stock. We planted them in our backyards. They grow fast, they grow in any kind of soil, they have beautiful fall color. And I will tell you from personal experience, they're very hard to kill. But wildscaping, whether we're doing it in our backyards or whether we're doing it over the landscape, there are certain elements that are involved with wildscaping. And the first one is that we do it. Wildscaping is a human activity. That means that you get together with your partner, you get together with your community association, you get together with your students, you get together with volunteers, and it's a human activity. And it's our interest in trying to promote an enhanced landscape for ourselves to enjoy and for wildlife to live in. And hopefully, in that process, we kind of think it through. We make a plan. And if you're a landscape architect, well, that's one of the things that you're well familiar with. You might even get someone to draw a design for your backyard. You might actually make a sketch. You might develop a plant list. You might have a vision. You might have a discussion, and over time have a process evolve. And we've done that too at the much larger level. It just so happens that at our level, that thought process is called a natural resource management plan. So we have that. It's on our website. It's pretty broadly thought out. It describes every activity, describes the different forms of wildlife that occur there. And one of the interesting things about going through that process is the more you think it through, the more you begin to realize that's going to cost something. You know, and unless you have some funding to kind of help you along the way, it is going to be very labor intensive. You know, you might want to hire a gardener. You might want to hire someone to actually do the installation for you. You might want to hire a contractor, in my case, to control Chinese tallow trees. Because man, if it had been poor little Kramer killing tallows all alone all these years at Armand Bayou Nature Center, he'd still be whittling on that first tree, probably. So funding is an important part of it. And once you've got that bigger picture together, the funding, of course, can be used to buy tools, to buy equipment. And at the landscape level, that may mean a $60,000 tractor and mowing implement to mimic some of those effects that the bison grazing would have had. In a homeowner's perspective, it might mean that you need to buy a hoe or whatever it is that might be useful for you in your own backyard. So defining all these various elements helps to give us a more comprehensive understanding of what it means to wildscape. And now, here's the rub. So remember, we have all these experts, we all have our difference of opinions and thoughts, and we went through a very difficult decision-making process back in the early mid-1990s. What we began to see was the conversion of large-scale habitat of those coastal tallgrass prairies at the Nature Center. Conversion meaning the Chinese tallows had been introduced, they were beginning to colonize, they were expanding. We were faced with a difficult decision for those of us that went to school during the time of Silent Spring, because we all grew up understanding the influences of many of those pesticides released into the environment, particularly insecticides like DDT. Insecticides that bioaccumulate over time. They work their way up the food chain. Oftentimes they reach their real pinnacle of impact in apex predators, in bald eagles and brown pelicans and peregrine falcons. Animals that, when I began at Armand Bayou Nature Center, were on the brink. They were not at the Nature Center, and we wondered if they might not be on this earth any longer. So we were faced with a difficult decision. Do we let the tallows completely convert these hundreds of acres into a monoculture, or do we take some action that we think hopefully can reverse that? And we decided to spray an aerial herbicide from helicopters on these areas that you see on the map, about 300 acres. And remember, it's a closed canopy forest, so the vast majority of the aerial spray landed on the Chinese tallow canopy, and it began to kill the trees over time. And as we began to think this through, we really began to discuss what it means to have that scientific viewpoint. And you know, one of the things that science really encourages us to do is to look through different lenses, to look through different macro, micro viewpoints. And one of the discussions that we had during this time period was, you know, for me as a person, if I got sick, and I mean I got really sick, I would go to the doctor, he would give me some medicine, hopefully that would cure me. If it didn't, I'd go back and see the doctor again, run some more tests, and he might say, you know, Mark, I'm sorry you have cancer, and it's a pretty serious disease, and we're going to put you through the ringer to try to cure it. We're going to give you some harsh chemicals. And you would have to make a decision if you would want to accept chemotherapy that might take you to the very brink yourself. You might wonder if it's even worth it at some point. But that would be a decision that you would have to make. And remember, we're moving from different lenses. I'm talking about the organism level now. But now we're going to expand our viewpoint through this wider lens, and we're all going to have to accept that this is a living ecosystem. And at the ecosystem level, we now have something very similar to what we have at the organism level. We're talking about this highly invasive species of the Chinese tallow tree, and we're going to have to make some difficult decisions. So when you put it in a different perspective, that's one of the great values of us coming together as groups like this, is trying to give each other different viewpoints and perspectives. We made this decision, and over these 2 years, we began to see these Chinese tallow trees die and decline. It's a picture of the world's greatest tallow farmer there for you to view. 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So a couple of things you notice about that picture, besides the fact there's not a single gray hair in Mark Kramer's beard. You begin to see the tallows die and decline here up above me. And that was a very exciting, happy moment, as you can see on my face, but don't look down. Because when you do, what we begin to talk about is when we move these plants and animals around, not only is a matter of it not having the natural set of checks and balances in its new home, the Chinese tallow tree is a formidable adversary because it has a long list of adaptations that enable it to survive. The tree exudes a white, toxic, milky sap. Nothing eats it. Browsing animals don't eat it. Insects don't eat it. It grows back from the stump if you cut it off. You can't just cut the tree down and kill it. It grows in any kind of soil, sandy soil, clayey soil, salty soils at the edge of the bayou. But when I say don't look down, each of these adult trees makes about 10,000 seeds a year. And those seeds can remain viable for up to a decade. So a long list of adaptive strategies. That's what enables invasive species to outcompete the native plants, in addition to the fact that it doesn't have that natural set of checks and balances in its home range. So moving forward, we began to use an integrated pest management approach, meaning we're trying to do a bunch of different layers to add cumulative stressors to the plant. And this is a mechanical device, a chipping machine. We actually have a chipping machine running right now as we speak at the Nature Center, turning these dead, dying tallow trees into wood mulch. This was about 1995. It was about the time that the cell phone was coming into vogue and popularity for use, and this is about the time people driving around the Nature Center would see the Nature Center chopping all the trees down. So that's a very difficult moment for Mark Kramer. They call the front desk, chopping all the trees down. The woman says, "Let me connect you with Mark. He'll tell you what's going on." And that's a hard moment when someone's driving at highway speed and you have about 30 seconds to tell this 45-minute story that I'm going to tell you now. But this integrated pest management approach includes herbicide usage, it includes mechanical control, it includes using chainsaws to cut trees down, it includes burning prescribed fire, as we'll see, and probably most importantly, it includes talking really badly about Chinese tallow trees at every opportunity. That's a stressor. I don't know if you've ever had anyone talk really badly about you a lot, over and over and over, but that's a stressor too. So we're hoping that over time, all of these things are going to bring us success. And remember, the real goal here is to bring back our wildscape, to bring back that beautiful assembly of the coastal prairie plant community. Bringing it back in this case, however, means we have to actually grow some of these locally rare plants. I am so happy to see Blazing Star for sale in the back there. You might have noticed that picture of what Blazing Star looks like in its natural range at Armand Bayou Nature Center. But we have some of the most dedicated volunteers. We began working in about 1995, quite some time ago, to propagate these types of plants. Now, Lauren was talking about pollinators, but my favorite thing are propagators. And raise your hand if you're a propagator. Some of you are doing that reluctantly. It's okay to be a propagator. And Prairie Friday people propagate native plants. And there are a number of the dedicated Prairie Friday team in the audience that I see smiling right now. So what's happened over time is that we've lost a lot of this native plant species base. We've lost switchgrass, gamagrass, big blue stem. These plants were sweet grasses to the cattle. When we fenced those pastures in, some of these plants disappeared first. We're also growing a lot of pollinators now. The wildflowers are also a big part of what we're doing with this big growing effort. Come see us on a Prairie Friday sometime. We'd like to have you there. You'll learn a little more about what we're doing. You might meet some people that you'd enjoy hanging out with. It happens every Friday morning. So just show up and we'll shake your hand. And the real reason that we do that is, remember I said this was the same story. We're trying to bring children into the backyard garden here. Our service learning program works with many of the local high schools and colleges. I have two of those college professors that I work with in the audience today from San Jacinto College and from the University of Houston Clear Lake. Thank you guys for all the opportunities you provide bringing students to the Nature Center. High schools and colleges bring students to help us plant the plants in the restoration sites, in our wildscapes. That's hard for the Prairie Friday team. This is hard work. But in a good morning, when we have 100 students, we can put 2,000 or 3,000 of those 1-gallon containers into the field before lunch. 2,000 or 3,000 1-gallon containers in the field before lunch. So that's affecting change at the landscape level. And over the years, over the decades actually, I actually need to do that calculation, just how many of those plants these service programs have put in. But not only do they do the work, we're trying to engage the next generation. They bring the students into the auditorium and they have an opportunity to learn about these local ecosystems. In fact, what we're trying to do is build a living museum. You might be trying to do that in your own backyard. 10 minutes? So now I'm gonna have to start talking fast. Is that right? Is that what you... I knew I should have done that from the beginning, and then I asked, am I talking too fast? Okay, so we're building a living museum. And we're doing that for wildlife. Just as Lauren is doing it for insects, we're doing it for larger populations, for larger species that are in steep decline. Particularly critically imperiled are grassland birds, shrikes, meadowlarks, song sparrows, and ducks. The mottled duck nests in coastal prairies. These birds have declined by 80% in the last 40 years. So steep declines in prairie bird species. And all of our long-term management effects mimic what would have happened historically, including prescribed burning. And I know there are some of you in the audience today that are itching to become new volunteer prescribed burn team members. We hold a class. If you're able-bodied and want to experience one of the most exciting natural spectacles in the world, which is being beside one of these controlled burns, Lan Shin looked me up a little earlier and said, "Are you burning this year?" I said, "I hope to, Lan." So here's the date. You guys can email me if you want to come to the class. So we're in the Bayou City. I'm going to shift gears now. I've taken way too much time talking about prairies like I always do. But the Bayou City, Buffalo Bayou, Sims Bayou, White Oak Bayou, and then there's Armand Bayou. And Armand Bayou is different. Armand Bayou is different. Once you are on Armand Bayou, you realize the special nature of Armand Bayou is that it has never been altered, never been channelized, never been straightened, widened, and deepened. Its edges are filled with beautiful wetlands and wildlife. So when you come to Armand Bayou, your sense immediately is this looks different than the bayous that I've seen, and that's because it's amongst the most beautifully preserved and productive. Productive meaning it's estuarine waters. The mixing of fresh water and salt water creates this productivity that is unrivaled. Rivals tropical reefs, tropical rainforest and coral reefs. One pull of a minnow net, oftentimes we catch several thousand of these small fish. But it doesn't mean it hasn't been impacted. Armand Bayou has changed, even though it's still the best of what we have left in the Bayou City. When you look at the image in 1953, look at this deep water meandering stream channel winding its way down towards Clear Lake, and look at all this abundant tidal marsh habitat all around the edges of it, that emergent grassland that grows up off the bayou bottom. Well, Naveen's video showed us Armand Bayou has subsided. It has sank somewhere between 6 and 8 feet since the 1950s. The sinking of the land surface is something we long-term Houston residents very familiar with. And look, in the blink of an eye again, where have all those marshes gone? About a 93% reduction in marsh habitat since the 1950s, and as a result, a tremendous amount of wetland habitat loss. So we worked for over a decade regrowing those marsh habitats. We worked with our friends at the Galveston Bay Foundation, NRG Energy, a number of partners, helping us grow those native plants, helping us to try to bring back those tidal marsh plant communities. And sometimes in your backyard, it's fun to just sit down. It's fun to just kind of daydream a little bit. One day we were daydreaming and we wondered, could we build an aquatic version of a peat pot? You guys, have you ever used a peat pot? It's a container that the root sits in, You put it in the ground, you don't even take it out of the container, and the peat pot kind of rots away and the roots kind of push through it. So this California bulrush plant once occurred all along medium salinity areas of Texas. Well, we grew a bunch of those California bulrush plants in a 3-gallon container, pulled it out of its plastic pot, wrapped its root base up in chicken wire, put about 4 or 5 pieces of concrete anchoring ballast in the bottom of it, and then we threw it off the boat. Then we made a bulrush bomb. So just sit down and have fun sometimes. You don't know. This became an opportunity for environmentalists all around the country to have a new way to use and install plant material. The bulrush bomb over 1 year time doesn't do much, but as the rhizomes grow out through that chicken wire, over a few years it creates a big island of habitat. And there is our commensurate long list of invasive bayou plants: water hyacinth, elephant ear, and our newest one, this Mexican petunia. We never know what is lurking next at the plant sale shop that is going to become our next invasive species here in the Houston area. But water hyacinth probably is our biggest aquatic invasive problem. It's a beautiful plant. It's purple, hyacinth-colored flower, came to New Orleans in the late 1800s as an exhibition plant, and all those colonial pond owners had to have this beautiful floating plant in their backyard. Well, unfortunately, it's now escaped to all the Gulf states. We saw it first in Armand Bayou in 1994, and since that time, you can see from this image, it has really become a problem. So we've talked about this list of special adaptations for these highly invasive species. Water hyacinth has that similar list. It's a floating plant that makes it very effective at colonizing. When the wind changes direction, it blows to a new home. When a flood event happens, it floats downstream and colonizes a new area. It also turns out to be one of the fastest growing plants on the planet. And in ideal growing conditions in the summer, it doubles its surface area every 10 days. So that's an explosive growth potential. You might imagine coming back every week and a half and finding twice as much of it. Not only that, it can reproduce not just sexually through seed production, it can also reproduce through fragmentation, meaning those small pup plants break off and it's created an identical clone. So very successful at completely dominating the water surface. And as this complete water surface coverage happens, the diffusion process for atmospheric oxygen at the water surface no longer happens. And as a result, hypoxia is created, essentially no oxygen in the water column below the water hyacinth. And of course, no oxygen in the water, that means no aquatic life. That means ecosystem collapse. And this is how oftentimes we as ecologists are forced to make the determination which plants we control with our limited budgets and which ones we don't. If a plant has the capacity to create ecosystem collapse, the decision is easier to know how to control the plant. And in the case of water hyacinth and Armand Bayou, it's not just an ecological impact, it's a recreational impact, meaning that that Texas paddling trail, that most popular canoe kayak destination in the Houston area, you can't paddle through water hyacinth. So all around the Gulf states, ecologists and land managers have considered the best management option for trying to control these huge hundreds of acres of plant is to spray it with Roundup. There have been many efforts of trying to pick it up, chop it up, haul it off, and the predicament, particularly in shallow water bodies like Armand Bayou, you just can't get a boat in to do it. You also have a pretty significant consideration as to what to do with that much plant material that is very heavy and 90% water once you get it at the land surface. So, over about the last 20-25 years, our significant marsh restoration effort has created about 26 acres of this type of tidal marsh habitat. You can see the white lines of where maybe some of you in the audience have helped with this project. And just as in your backyard, one of the most rewarding things you see is wildlife returning to your wildscape. And for me, over this time period, to see these charismatic species like the river otter, many hundreds of red-winged blackbirds returning to California bulrush marshes, waterfowl, some of our resident waterfowl that actually stays here all year, wood ducks, mottled ducks, now returning to those wetland areas, and smaller obscure species of rail like the sora, and for me, my very favorite, the smallest member of the heron family, a bird species that even hardcore bird watchers have a difficult time finding and viewing, is the least bittern. Now, we call herons and egrets wade-feeding birds, but that doesn't apply to the least bittern. They have these special feet that are adapted to grab stem to stem in the California bulrush marsh, and they never get their feet wet. So it's very fun to watch these guys as they move. And I actually created a new word for you today. We're going to call it endangereds. It's the plural of endangered species. So for me, one of my favorite things to see through these years is those species that we thought at the time of DDT might leave us forever, we actually now see right in Pasadena, Texas, right at Armand Bayou Nature Center, the return of the brown pelican, the return of the apex predator, the American alligator. And as Naveen pointed out, we have a nesting pair of bald eagles at Armand Bayou Nature Center now. And as time has gone by, we've begun to see these guys. And you know, one of the things that I really want to point out, a lot of these pictures, Naveen doesn't know this, but that green kayaker that you saw in her video is a fellow by the name of Gary Seeloff. And he is one of the most beautiful wildlife photographers that we have. Here's a picture of us cultivating not just the next generation of humans, but also the next generation of wildlife. So they don't have a voice to say thank you. So I want to take this opportunity for all of those returning species that might come to your backyard or into my backyard, and on behalf of all of those returning species, say thank you to you for the work that you do right in your own backyard. Thank you.